The new Imaginarium Theatre just dropped upon the new year of 2025, so let us jump straight into the guide. Of course, before we get started, I'm just gonna do a quick disclaimer. Number one, I'm gonna assume you have enough characters in order to do the respective difficulty and of course do the theatre in the first place. And second is more of a slight new update how I'm going to run the theatre guide. I'm gonna try to spend more time to make the guide more thorough, and there are going to be a lot of sections talking about different guides or different tips that I can give you, specific down to different enemies or different bounties or what kind of builds or blessings should you take. So I'll leave all the timestamps down in the description below, so feel free to skip to whichever part that you find to be difficult. So the element for this time around is Pyro, Cryo, and Geo, making the possible reactions between Melt and Pyro and Cryo Crystallize. The opening characters are as given: Diluc, Bennett, Ganyu, Kea, Navia, and Noel. While the special invitation characters are Shen Yun, Ayato, Fischl, and Sayu, and of course these 4 units you can only bring them if you do have them in your account. Now, for recommended characters, a lot of the characters, if you do have them, is going to be useful one way or another. I would say this time around, due to how strong the blessings are, off-field elemental applicators or off-field DPS would be highly appreciated even if they don't do a lot of damage, because as long as you're able to trigger the blessings through the reactions, you would be getting a good amount of damage boost and on top of some nice extra damage. Obviously, aside from the good straightforward supports like Bennett or Shang Ling and such, try to basically use whatever characters that can help you trigger their reactions. And for the ones that I don't really recommend, I would say it's between Chevreau, Premine, Xinyan, Mika, mostly characters that don't really have any sort of off-field presence or they don't really contribute too much to your team. Those are the characters that I don't really recommend using because they don't really add too much to the actual fight. However, if you do have a few 5-star units, even if there are DPS, feel free to bring them if you can, but just try to not bring too much. Now, let me go over some general tips that you can use for this time around. Due to how Pyro has like a lot of DPS characters, I would highly recommend you to prioritize a good balance of supports and off-field applicators relevant to the previous tip over DPS, but you also want a decent amount of DPS that you can kind of use to maybe throw away, like maybe your weaker DPS you can put in the earlier acts, and then you can save your stronger DPS for the later, more challenging acts. So tip number 2 is try to trigger debuffs based on whatever brilliant blessings you take, and this is especially useful if you do want to get additional damage for your team's DPS on top of having some good AoE. And of course, alongside that, try to choose the blessings that is based on your current lineup rather than based on what you're building towards, because you can only use each character up to a maximum of 2 times unless you get like lucky with mystery caches and gain some vigor restoration. This will help you a lot in fighting against the character RNG in the event that you don't actually get the character or team that you want. Tip number 3 is to try to throw away your weaker characters on the earlier acts like Act 1, Act 2, maybe even Act 3, so that this allows you to actually save stronger units for the future acts, because stars are not important to getting the actual rewards. They are nothing more than a way to basically flex to others. So at the very least, as long as you're able to clear them, you can always throw away your weaker characters if you do find chambers with enemies that are very easy to clear or very easy to kill. Okay, so the buff this time around, we do have the regular Melt buff, Pyro Crystal, and Cryo Crystal. I'll quickly brief over what the buffs actually do, and I will leave a link down in the description to the Google Docs that I made with a small detail of every single buff that you can take as well as what is going to be good for you. So Melt, generally whenever you trigger Melt the first level, you'll basically gain an AoE, Cryo, or Pyro damage, which depends on which one you triggers. Like you trigger Pyro Melt, you get a Cryo called a Frostfall. If you trigger Cryo Melt, you get a Flame Spire. And the levels above there is split into 2 different branches. So for Melt, most of it is really straightforward. The upgrades are either between upgrading the instance of damage you gain from the blessing or increasing the Melt damage that you do. Later on the line, you will actually get some Cryo and Pyro res. I do highly recommend this one if you want to amplify your Melt damage to the absolute maximum. For the Pyro and Cryo Crystallize, both of them are very similar. It's just what they do is essentially the same thing. It's just that they're different elements. So what it does is that whenever you take Pyro shards, you gain Pyro or Cryo Geo damage bonus. The blessing will also spawn elemental shards near you every 4 seconds. The upgrades from there actually breaks down into 2 different branches. The first branch focuses on AoE Geo damage that triggers every 4 seconds, while the second branch is focused on single target damage, but it has a lower cooldown at 2 seconds. And the rest beyond there is really a matter of whether you want to go for more AoE damage or you want to go for more instances of single target damage. The level 4 upgrade for both Crystallize will actually reduce the enemy Geo and Cryo or Pyro resistance, so I highly recommend taking the AoE blessing. Now, I did quite a few runs of Theatre over the past few days, so I'll give you a few very discrete tips for every single combat axe based on the enemies you're going to go against. So if you do get the combo of the Ruin Drake and the Ruin Grader, you'll be facing only one of each. So this one is relatively easy because aside from having high physical resistance, they actually are very easy to kill and they don't really move all too much. So there's no fancy mechanic to worry about here. Of course, both of them do have their respective weak point mechanic, but if you have a decently invested team or a strong enough blessing, you should be able to kill them very fast. Now, if you do select the option where you go against the Cryo Cicin mages, my recommendation is really just bring at least one Pyro character for the Cryo Cicin mage because Geo is going to take a bit of time to kill them. Now, if you do get the Eroding Avatars of Lava, these guys are also relatively easy because unlike their cousin, they don't actually take less Pyro damage. They do have a mechanic where you can build enough Pyro for the bar to basically kill it instantly, but otherwise, they're very straightforward enemies. Now, if you do have to choose the Ereremite trio for your Monolith defense, they will always try to focus on the Monolith, so try to kill them as fast as possible. And it's very difficult to pull aggro because they're very much hard focused on destroying that tower. So if you do have abilities like Deluxe Elemental Burst, it is especially nice to crowd control them and push them away from the defense tower. Although, as difficult as it may seem, these guys don't actually attack very fast, so it's possible for you to not use any crowd control characters and still clear and get the star for that chamber. Now, if you do have to go against the Bathysmal Vishaps, these guys have high physical resistance and slightly high hydro resistance. You'll start off with going against 2 small ones and followed by a wave of 2 large ones. The only mechanic of note is to try to dodge this supercharged spit attack, otherwise you will lose health and energy even through your shield. Now, if you do have to choose between either Electro or Geo Rifthounds, I highly recommend choosing the Geo Rifthounds because the current theatre does allow you to bring Geo characters. While these guys do have boosted resistance to all elements, once you build the bar with enough Geo attacks, they enter an aggravated or enraged state. While their attacks are more aggressive and frequent, they also take much more Geo damage. I do recommend bringing a simple healer in order to keep your active character alive. However, if you do have the 4 extra characters for the HP buff or the blessing, you don't necessarily need to do that. On top of that, if your team has very good DPS, you can probably clear the chamber faster before any of your party member falls. Now, if you have to choose the Consecrated Beast in the later acts, you'll be facing against 1 Scorpion and 1 Bird. My general recommendation is just to go for the Scorpion and the Bird will generally focus towards you. And of course, every Consecrated Beast has their own mechanic with their elemental block. Just hit them with their own element or just hit it with elemental attacks and you can hit them and stun them for a brief period of time. For the Monolith defense, the easiest one to pick is generally the one with a singular Ruin Guard. This one is easy because you can actually throw away all your weaker characters and you only have to deal with 1 Ruin Guard at a time. And because the challenge requires you to defend the Monolith until the time runs out, you can even opt to not kill the Ruin Guard at all and basically just AFK for the next 3 minutes. If you, for whatever reason, cannot get this as an option, you can consider re-rolling your events or rewinding your performance if needed. So the other options you have are the Lawachurl Metachurl combo or the Ruin Robots. I highly advise against choosing the Ruin Robot combo because it's very difficult to pull their aggro and it's very hard to really group them both together. However, your second best option would be the Lawachurl group. So the Monolith defense for Lawachurl, they'll spawn 1 Cryo and Electro Lawachurl, which will alternate, and they'll spawn 2 Axe Metachurls, which will always go for the Monolith. Once you do enough damage to these Metachurls, they will always aggro towards you. So my recommendation is find a way to actually target the Metachurls, kill them as fast as possible, but ensure that you keep watch on the Lawachurl and stay away from the Monolith. So that way, if the Lawachurl were to ever do its jump attack or dash towards you, you can at least find a way to make sure it doesn't hit the Monolith along the way. My strategy here is to at least kill 2 Metachurls first, and because they can only have a maximum of 3 enemies at a time, you could possibly keep the 2 Cryo and Electro Lawachurl focused towards you and only focus on killing the Metachurl while ensuring that they don't attack the Monolith. And if you're able to do this properly, you can easily get the star along the way. Now for the bounty, I think you will get a few options of Kairagis. I think it's the Geo Golems, and I believe the last one is the Eroding Avatars of Lava. My recommendation is to choose the Kairagis or the Eroding Avatars of Lava. Now I'm unsure what the conditions are, but certain times you will only have to kill 2 bounties instead of 3, but otherwise it's not generally that difficult. Don't pay attention to all the side mobs, focus on the bounty, burst them down and you will be going to Act 10. So by the time you already cleared Act 9, my recommendation is to grab as much buffs as possible for Act 10 because the Yumkasaur is decently tanky, and maybe if you don't have enough characters, you can also try to get that before your final battle. And our last tip I can give is that if you do get the Battle Elite Assault very early on, you can choose that option to gain 20 more Fantasia Flowers. And because the enemies are relatively weak, this should be quite easy to do. Now, if we move on to the bosses, we have the Primo Geovishap, which is the Hydro version, the Electro Regisvine, the Solitary Suanni from Chenyu Vale, and the Yumkasaur King. So the Primo Vishap, you already know what he does by now. He's Hydro, but you don't have Hydro this time around, so there's not really much to worry about. However, he does have high Geo resistance, so do keep that in mind. And he does kind of move a lot, similar to all my other previous videos. Try to go to its side or at least go behind it in order to ensure it doesn't move that much. If it was to do the tree fur combo where it does massive swings, try to dodge the first one and go behind him after the second. He'll do the final slam attack at your direction. And if he does the primordial shower move, you can use either a Geo or a Hydro Shield, but because this is a Geo Theatre, you can bring shielders like Zhongli or Noelle. Okay, so this mechanic I'm gonna have to go a little bit in depth to explain how you can get a Hydro Crystallize without having to bring a Geo or a Hydro character from the Primo Geovishap. So what you want to do is you want to keep your distance and be in front of it, and then it will do the one breath attack, of which it will apply Hydro on top of you. And the moment you get Hydro applied on top of you, immediately go to its back or where its tail is, and then it will start doing the spin attack. Let that spin attack hit you, and what happens is that it will do geo damage to you, thus generating a Hydro Crystallize shield. You can wait a little bit, and then afterwards it'll do the primordial shower attack, then you can stagger it with the Hydro Crystallize shield. If you can play around this mechanic, you will be able to stagger him and he will lose a lot of HP. Now for the Electro Regisvine is probably the hardest one, so whenever you start playing the theater, I highly recommend you to save your good Cryo and Pyro applicators or off-fielders for this chamber. So you only have 1 minute to clear, and unlike its cousin, the Electro Regisvine works a bit differently. Instead of starting at the root, its corolla or the electro weak point starts on its head. So nothing much can be done here unless you bring bow range units like Linny or Ganyu or even Amber to a certain extent. So it does have a few moves like the one where it does the 2 laser moves and it does the massive laser beam in front of you, or of course it just does 2 swings before it slams its face directly into the ground. My recommendation is get used to the pattern, try to prepare your abilities right after it does its second move, and make sure you focus on the corolla to break it as fast as possible. If you're playing someone like Arlecchino or Hu Tao, try to really pay a bit of attention because it is possible for the game's auto-targeting system to actually screw you by making you focus the root instead of the corolla on its head. So once you break it, just burst it down, rinse and repeat, and if you fail to kill it, wait a little bit, and after another 2 more moves, it will also start to summon the corolla at its root. Save your abilities for this moment, break it as fast as possible, and use all your massive damage abilities to kill it before the timer runs out. By the time you get to around this duration or this time, you would only have about 15 to 20 seconds at best, so be sure to really get used to its pattern and save your abilities at the right time. One extra tip that I can give here is that if you do happen to have Amber, Amber's Elemental Burst is really good at breaking both of his weak points, so be sure to save her Elemental Burst or maybe bring her here if you're having trouble breaking the weak point. So the Solitary Suanni is the boss from Chenyu Vale. It has a mechanic where it wants you to bring Cryo characters to trigger Freeze and bring either a Geo unit or a Claymore character to trigger Shatter, because doing so will generally stun it for about 10 seconds. So aside from that whole mechanic, it does have 2 big moves of note. The first move, if you bring a Cryo character, you're never really gonna see it. It will become Hydro Infused. You want to freeze it with Cryo and then trigger Shatter to stun it for the next 10 to 15 seconds. On the other hand, I managed to get footage for this, but he does also do this big Anemo charge up move. It will spawn 2 Anemo orbs floating around in the outer circle, hit those Anemo orbs with all the swirlable elements like Pyro, Hydro, Electro, Cryo, or this case it's Pyro and Cryo, and then after that you can stun it for the next 10 seconds, and the rest is basically straightforward. So it is ideal that you bring any Cryo character. It doesn't have to be a Cryo DPS, just bring any Cryo character to apply the element so that you can actually trigger Shatter on it, and then he'll be stunned for a while. Otherwise, you have like over 2 minutes to clear this guy, so I think he's probably one of the easiest, if not the easiest boss in the current theater. In the final boss, we do have the Yumkasaur King, who is a very straightforward battle. There are 2 tips that I can give in regard to this guy. So after a certain amount of moves has passed, he will spawn 3 of these pomegranate explosive fruits, hit all 3 of these fruits with Pyro before it swallows a single one of them, and these fruits will actually explode, do a lot of damage to him, and make him stun for the next few seconds. The second tip I can give is that whenever it puffs its belly twice, it will essentially do the spinning attack which will chase towards you. So if you are finding it difficult to kill it fast, you can be sure to watch out for this attack so that you can play around its ability. Otherwise, that's it for the theater guide. This is probably the most comprehensive guide that I've probably released by far for the Imaginarium Theatre. So if you don't have enough characters built, well, you can try to opt for the lower difficulty because the lower difficulty would have less bosses. And if you have any sort of problems or troubles, feel free to leave a comment down in the description below and I will try to help you to the best of my ability. Otherwise, that is it for today's video. This is Ethereal, signing off, and I wish you all a good run. Peace out.